They called him useless, as if all the years he spent coaxing life from the stubborn earth had amounted to nothing. The words hung in the air like a sour smell, hard to shake off even after the crowd had wandered away. But Walter Harris didn't move from the edge of his porch. He just watched the pickup truck disappear down the dirt road, dust curling in its wake. He was 72 years old, a retired farmer, a veteran of a war nobody seemed to remember anymore. And though his hands were gnarled and his back stooped, his spirit was a kind of quiet iron. The sun was starting to sink behind the western fields, pouring gold over the rows of corn that still stood tall despite the drought. Walter had always believed that if you treated land with respect, it would give you something back. But lately, the land was tired. Like him. The rains had failed 2 summers in a row. The yield had dropped to almost nothing, and the bank had decided the farm was no longer worth the trouble. It wasn't the first time they'd driven up that dirt road to lecture him about missed payments and inefficiencies. But today, the tone had shifted. They weren't pretending to be understanding anymore. A young man in an ill-fitting suit had stepped down from the truck and addressed Walter like he was some old dog refusing to leave the porch. "Mr. Harris," he'd said, not meeting Walter's eyes, "your time's up. You've had every extension the bank can justify. The board has decided to foreclose." Walter had simply nodded. He'd known it was coming. What he hadn't expected was the way the young man's co-worker, a sharp-faced woman, had leaned over the truck bed and muttered, "He's useless. Just a waste of space. Can't even keep his own land going. Maybe they thought he couldn't hear. Maybe they didn't care." But Walter heard every word, and in that moment, something in him cinched tight. He looked out at the farm. Fences he'd built with his own hands, barns he'd mended when the wind tore them apart. He saw his late wife's rose bushes along the path to the kitchen door, the same path she used to walk in the evenings, basket on her hip. And he knew he would not be driven off this land without a fight, no matter how little they thought of him. When the truck finally disappeared, Walter turned and stepped inside the house. The screen door creaked behind him. Inside, the place smelled of old cedar and coffee grounds. A thin line of sunlight fell across the kitchen table, striking the framed photograph of his unit back in 1970. Young men squinting into the jungle heat, their arms slung over each other's shoulders. He picked it up, feeling the weight of all those memories. "You boys would have laughed," he said aloud, voice catching in his throat. "Useless. That's what I've come to." He set the picture back down and sank into the chair. The arthritis made it hard to move quickly these days, but he'd learned patience. It was the only way you survived years in the fields, or a lifetime of being underestimated. He rubbed his temples and thought about how it had come to this. The drought, the falling crop prices, the mounting bills. But mostly it was the way people looked at him now, as if he were invisible, as if old age meant he had nothing left to offer. The clock ticked in the quiet kitchen. Outside, the last light was fading from the corn. Walter knew he couldn't let their words be the last judgment on his life. He would call the Veterans Assistance Office in the morning. Maybe there were grants he hadn't thought of. Maybe some lawyer somewhere knew a clause he'd missed. He wasn't ready to give up. As he reached for the notepad where he kept every important phone number, the front door rattled. At first he thought the wind had come up, but then he heard a voice, tentative, almost embarrassed. "Mr. Harris? You home?" It was Callie Dunn, the neighbor's daughter. She was in her late 20s, earnest and sharp-eyed. Walter had watched her grow up, running around with skinned knees and a laugh that echoed across the fields. He forced himself up and opened the door. Callie stood there holding a casserole dish, her gaze darting to the battered truck tracks in the drive. "I saw them leave," she said, voice low. Well, Mama heard what they said, about you, and I just wanted you to know you're not alone." Her words landed in the space inside him that had been hollowed out by the years, by loss, by disappointment. He swallowed against the ache in his throat. "Thank you, Callie," he managed. She held the dish out to him. "You'll need your strength. And I know some folks at the county office. If you want, I can ask around." He took the casserole and felt a tremor of something he hadn't let himself feel in months. Hope. "That might be a help," he said. The two of them stood in the doorway a moment longer, the night air cool on their faces. Then Callie gave him a nod and walked back across the yard. Walter closed the door and set the dish on the counter. He drew in a long, steadying breath. They'd called him useless, but tomorrow he'd start proving them wrong. The dawn broke, pale and reluctant, over Harris Farm, throwing a wash of thin light across the parched fields. Walter stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the sky brighten. The ache in his shoulders reminded him of every year he'd spent working this land, but it also reminded him that he was still here. And so was the farm for now. After Callie's visit, he'd slept more deeply than he had in weeks. Maybe it was the comfort of knowing someone still cared. Maybe it was the casserole, a simple kindness, but one that felt like an anchor. This morning, he felt clear-headed enough to start making calls. He set the coffee down and pulled out his notepad, flipping past lists of fertilizer orders and old addresses until he found the number for the Veterans Assistance Office in town. He pressed the phone to his ear, trying to ignore the worry coiled tight in his chest. For decades, he'd prided himself on handling his own business. Even when Mildred was alive, she'd let him take care of the finances. Asking for help felt like admitting defeat. But he'd reached a point where pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. A woman with a clipped, efficient voice answered. Her name was Donna. Walter explained his situation, how the drought had gutted his income, how the bank had finally decided he wasn't worth the trouble. "There's a program that provides emergency assistance to elderly veterans facing foreclosure," Donna said. "You'll need documentation. Discharge papers, proof of residence, medical records. Do you have those handy?" "I believe so," he said. "I can get them together." She paused, her voice softening. "Mr. Harris, I'm going to help you get this application submitted today. But you should also know that the county council has a discretionary fund for senior citizens in crisis. I can connect you to the right person." He felt something unspool in his chest, like a rope going slack. "I'd appreciate that." By the time he hung up, his coffee had gone cold. He didn't mind. The call had left him steadier than he'd been in a long while. He set about gathering every piece of paperwork he could find, files going back 20 years, some so brittle with age they nearly fell apart in his hands. He laid them in neat stacks across the kitchen table. His late wife had always teased him about his obsession with order, but today it felt like a lifeline. He was still sorting papers when he heard the familiar sound of tires on gravel. He stepped to the window, expecting it might be Callie again, but the car was unfamiliar, a sleek silver sedan with government plates. For a moment, he thought the bank had come early to serve final papers, and his stomach tightened. But when the door opened, a tall man in a dark suit stepped out, glancing around as if to take in every detail of the property. Walter opened the door before the man could knock. "Mr. Harris?" the man said, offering a polite nod. "I'm Senator Charles Yates." Walter blinked. He recognized the name, of course. Yates was the state senator whose office handled veterans' affairs. But he'd never expected to see him standing on his porch. "Senator," he said cautiously, "didn't expect, well, any of this." The man smiled, faint lines creasing the corners of his eyes. "I was in the area for a town hall. I heard about your situation from the Veterans Assistance Office. I wanted to meet you in person. Walter stepped aside to let him in, feeling vaguely embarrassed by the clutter of papers on the kitchen table. But the senator didn't seem to mind. He walked over to the photograph of Walter's unit, studying the faces. "You served in Vietnam?" Yates asked. "I did," Walter said quietly. "4th Infantry. Long time ago." Yates turned to face him. "Men like you built this country. I think it's disgraceful that banks treat you like a number on a ledger." Walter felt heat rising in his face. No one had spoken up for him like this, not since the day he'd come back from the war, when Mildred had met him at the bus depot, clutching a bouquet of daisies and telling him he'd done enough. The senator's words stirred something long buried, a sense that maybe he was still worth defending. "I'm not asking for handouts," Walter said, his voice rough. "Just time." "I understand," Yates said. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a business card. "My office can coordinate with the county council, and if necessary, we'll explore legal injunctions to halt the foreclosure while you apply for aid." Walter took the card, holding it as if it might vanish. "Thank you. Thank you." The senator nodded and clasped his shoulder briefly. "You've earned it." They talked for another 15 minutes. Yates asked thoughtful questions about the farm, the water table, and the impact of the drought. When he finally left, Walter watched the sedan roll back down the road, feeling dazed but oddly hopeful. Later, he carried the senator's card to the living room and set it on the mantel next to the photo of Mildred. He imagined what she'd say if she were here, probably something about how dignity doesn't come from land or money, but from how you face the world when it tries to push you down. Walter looked out the window at the fading afternoon and felt, for the first time in months, that maybe he still had some fight left in him. The next morning dawned clear, the sky a washed-out blue that seemed almost apologetic after so many weeks of drought. Walter woke before the sun, as he had every day for 50 years, and stepped onto the porch with a cup of fresh coffee. He watched the wind move over the brittle corn, bending the stalks in a slow ripple. For a moment he allowed himself to imagine the fields green again, rich with the promise of harvest. He didn't linger on the thought. There was work to do, calls to make, forms to fill out, and plans to salvage whatever he could. He went back inside and dialed the Veterans Assistance Office. Donna answered right away, her voice brisk but kind. "I have your case open in front of me," she said. "I've spoken to Senator Yates's staff. They're coordinating with the county council to see about emergency funding." Walter exhaled slowly. "That's good to hear." "I also need you to sign the preliminary relief paperwork," she continued. "It will temporarily halt the foreclosure process for 30 days. "I can come into town today," Walter said. "We'll be ready for you." He hung up, feeling steadier than he had in weeks. It was remarkable how a small glimmer of help could lift the weight of despair. He gathered the stack of documents into a worn leather folder, his discharge papers, tax records, property deeds, and set it by the door. As he straightened up, he caught sight of himself in the hallway mirror. The man staring back looked every bit his 72 years. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and his hair, once thick and black, had thinned to a soft, snowy cap. But there was something unbowed in his reflection, too. He'd survived worse than this. An hour later, he eased his old pickup down the county highway. The truck rattled with every pothole, but it had been faithful all these years. The radio crackled a country song he half remembered, and for a moment he let himself hum along. When he pulled into the parking lot of the Veterans Office, he saw Callie Dunn's little sedan parked in the far corner. She was waiting by the entrance, wrapped in a faded blue cardigan. "Thought you might need company," she called, giving him a tentative wave. Walter climbed out and shut the door. "You didn't have to come." "I know," she said. but I wanted to. Inside, Donna greeted them with a warm handshake. She wore a neat gray suit and glasses that slipped down her nose whenever she looked at her computer screen. "We'll get this started right away," she said, ushering Walter to a chair by her desk. For the next hour, they reviewed every line of every document. Walter signed where Donna pointed, his hand trembling a little each time. When they reached the last form, Donna leaned back in her chair and regarded him over the tops of her glasses. "This buys you 30 days, she said. "And I'm going to push hard for a full grant to cover at least 2 mortgage payments. That should give you breathing room." Walter swallowed the tightness in his throat. "I'm grateful." "You've earned it," she said simply. On the way out, Callie looped her arm through his. It reminded him of how his daughter Lisa used to do the same thing before she moved 3 states away. He hadn't told Lisa everything that was happening. He knew she'd worry herself sick, and he couldn't bear the thought of her scraping together money she didn't have to save the farm. He'd always promised he'd leave her something when he was gone. They stood on the sidewalk in the bright noon sun. Walter felt almost dizzy with relief. He'd expected today to be nothing more than another humiliation, a confirmation that he was alone in this fight. Instead, he'd found something he'd been missing, a sense that his life still mattered. "Thank you for coming," he told Callie. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "You were there for my dad when he had that heart attack in the field. You called the ambulance, and you sat with us at the hospital. People remember that." Walter looked at her, surprised. "That was a long time ago. Doesn't mean it doesn't count," she said softly. He nodded, feeling the old ache in his chest, the blend of sorrow and gratitude that came when life surprised him with kindness. They said their goodbyes, and he climbed back into his truck. As he drove away, he thought about the word useless, how easily it had been tossed at him, as if his worth could be measured in bushels per acre or dollars per week. But in that moment, he knew the truth. Worth didn't disappear just because other people stopped seeing it. He drove home with the folder on the passenger seat, the papers rustling whenever he hit a bump. They were only documents, thin and fragile, but to him, they felt heavier than iron. They were proof that he hadn't been forgotten. And that, he thought as the farm came into view again, was something worth holding on to. The next few days passed in a rhythm Walter hadn't felt in years, a slow, purposeful march towards something better. He rose early every morning, made himself breakfast, and spent hours sorting through old records and letters. It wasn't just about the paperwork anymore. It was about reclaiming a sense of ownership over his life. One afternoon, as he was cataloging receipts in the living room, the phone rang. He recognized the number. It was Senator Yates's office. He braced himself, heart thumping in his chest. "Mr. Harris," the staffer said, "the senator asked me to follow up personally. The county council approved a short-term emergency grant. You'll be receiving funds within the week." Walter shut his eyes, the relief almost dizzying. That's more than I hoped for." "There's one more thing," she added. "The senator is putting together a public town meeting about how small farms are treated. He'd like you to attend as a guest." For a moment, Walter didn't know what to say. He'd spent years feeling invisible. Now people he'd never met were asking him to stand up and be seen. "I'll be there," he said finally. When he hung up, he set the phone down on the kitchen table next to Mildred's old ceramic sugar jar. He rested his hand against the cool porcelain as if to steady himself. She would have been so proud. She'd always told him his stubbornness was a kind of blessing, if only he'd learned to use it. Outside, the breeze was picking up, carrying with it the dusty scent of dry earth. He went to the porch and watched a pickup drive past, probably one of the neighboring farms. For all the years he'd lived there, he'd never realized how many other families were just holding on by their fingernails. That evening, Callie stopped by again with a stack of flyers. She set them on the kitchen table with a hopeful look. "These are about the town meeting," she explained. "I thought maybe you'd want to put a few up around the co-op." Walter picked one up. It was simple, bold black letters on white paper, Community Forum on Family Farms. Below that, in smaller print, was his own name. "You don't have to speak," she said quickly, "but if you want to tell your story, well, people might listen." He traced the edge of the flyer with a thumb, thinking of all the years he'd kept quiet, letting the bank tell him what he was worth, letting the drought dictate how much he could produce. He thought about how it felt to hear that word, useless, and how it still stung, even now. "I think I will speak," he said finally. "If only so, no one else has to hear what I heard." Callie smiled, relief and admiration mingling in her eyes. "I think that's the best thing I've heard all week." They spent the next hour making a list of places to leave the flyers: the post office, the church, the diner where all the farmers gathered for coffee. By the time she left, it was full dark, and Walter felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. Later that night, he sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the flyers. He thought about Lisa again, how he would have to call her and explain everything. He'd been putting it off, wanting to spare her the worry, but he knew she deserved the truth. He picked up the phone and dialed her number, his hand trembling only a little. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Hi, Dad," she said. "Everything okay?" He took a breath. "I've got something to tell you." It took longer than he expected to get it all out. The foreclosure, the grant, the senator. She listened without interrupting, but he could hear the emotion in her breathing. "Oh, Dad," she said softly when he finished. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" "I didn't want to worry you," he admitted. "And I guess I didn't want you to think I couldn't handle things." There was a pause. Then she said, "You've handled everything your whole life. But you don't have to handle it alone." For a moment, he couldn't find words. He pressed a hand to his eyes, feeling the wetness gather there. He hadn't cried in years, but the kindness, so unexpected, so undeserved, broke something loose in him. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'm proud of you," she said. "And I'll come home next weekend to help you get things sorted." They talked a while longer, about little things. The weather in her city, her kids' soccer games, the price of groceries. When he finally hung up, he felt something inside him shift. Maybe he wasn't so alone after all. He looked around the kitchen, the dim lamplight pooling in familiar corners. He thought about tomorrow, about the meeting and the people who would come to listen, and he felt ready to stand up and tell his story. On the morning of the town meeting, Walter woke before dawn. The house was hushed and still, the kind of quiet that seemed to hold its breath. He dressed slowly, choosing his best clean shirt, a pale blue button-down Mildred had given him for their anniversary years ago. As he slipped it on, he felt her presence like a comforting hand on his shoulder. By the time the sun crested the far hills, he was already in his truck, the box of flyers beside him. The highway stretched empty and silent as he drove into town, and for once he didn't feel the familiar dread in his chest. Instead, there was a steadiness, as though every mile he traveled was another step away from that word. Useless. The town hall was a squat brick building on Main Street, with a faded flag fluttering in the breeze. A small crowd had already gathered by the doors, men in seed company caps, women in sturdy work clothes, a few younger folks who looked like they'd come from the co-op. Senator Yates was there too, greeting people as they arrived. When Walter stepped from his truck, a hush rippled through the group. He felt their eyes on him, not pitying this time, but respectful, curious. He lifted a hand in greeting, surprised by how steady it felt. Yates came over, hand extended. "Mr. Harris," he said warmly, "I'm glad you made it." "I said I would," Walter replied. They shook hands, and Walter followed the senator inside. The hall smelled of floor polish and coffee. Folding chairs were arranged in tidy rows, most already filled. A portable PA system sat near the podium. Callie was there too, organizing a stack of papers on a side table. When she spotted him, her face lit up. "You're here," she said, coming over. "I saved you a seat up front." He settled into the chair she pointed out, resting his hands on his knees to keep them from trembling. The meeting began promptly at 9, with Yates stepping up to the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," the senator began, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "We're here today to talk about the challenges facing small family farms, the economic pressures, the environmental hardships, and the human cost of indifference." He spoke about drought relief, about unfair lending practices, about the families who were losing everything. And then he paused, scanning the audience until his gaze landed on Walter. "Today," Yates continued, "we have with us someone whose story deserves to be heard. Walter Harris has worked his land for more than 50 years. He's a veteran, a father, and a neighbor to many of you. He's also a reminder that no one is beyond the reach of hardship or the reach of hope." Walter felt every eye turn toward him. His throat went dry, but he stood. When he reached the podium, he took a moment to steady his breathing. He looked out over the rows of faces, familiar and not, and thought of all the mornings he'd watched the sunrise over his fields, all the nights he'd lain awake wondering how it had come to this. "My name is Walter Harris," he began, his voice rough but clear. "I was born in this county. I fought in Vietnam. I came home, married my wife, and built my life around a piece of land my father left me. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I did everything right, I'd be safe." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But life doesn't always work that way," he went on. "Sometimes the rain stops coming. Sometimes the prices drop so low you can't make the numbers add up. Sometimes the bank looks at your land and decides you're just a liability." He swallowed, feeling the heat rise in his face. "A week ago they called me useless, said I'd wasted their time, and for a minute, I believed them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. He saw Callie standing near the back, her hands clasped tight, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But I'm here to tell you," Walter said, his voice gathering strength, "that no one who feeds people is useless. No one who gives their life to the land is a waste." A silence fell over the hall, heavy, expectant. "I don't know what will happen next," he admitted. "Maybe the grant will keep my farm going. Maybe it won't. But I'm not ashamed anymore, because I know I did everything I could." Someone started to clap. He thought it might have been Callie, and soon the hall was filled with applause. Walter felt his eyes sting, and he ducked his head, overcome by the wave of support. When he stepped away from the podium, Yates clasped his hand in both of his. "That was exactly what people needed to hear," the senator said. Walter only nodded. Two moved to speak. As he returned to his seat, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. After the meeting ended, people gathered around Walter in small knots, waiting to shake his hand or clap him on the shoulder. Some he knew, neighbors who'd watched him work those fields since he was a young man. Others were strangers, but they spoke to him with the same respect. "You said what we've all been thinking," one woman told him, her voice trembling. "It takes guts to stand up there." A tall man in overalls nodded. "You reminded us that we matter too." Callie hovered nearby, smiling through tears. When the crowd thinned, she came over and hugged him without waiting for permission. He was startled for a moment, then wrapped his arms around her. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her cheek pressed against his shoulder. He patted her back awkwardly, feeling warmth bloom in his chest. "I'm just an old farmer," he said. "Maybe," she replied, stepping back to look him in the eye. "But you're the one who showed everyone they don't have to be ashamed." Senator Yates joined them then, holding a folder under his arm. "Mr. Harris," he said, "I wanted you to know I've been speaking to the Agricultural Board. There are funds set aside for sustainable farm recovery. It's not a guarantee, but with your history and the drought declarations, I believe you'll have a strong case." Walter blinked. "You think it'll be enough to hold on to the place?" The senator's expression was sober but hopeful. "I think it might. But no matter what happens, you've helped put a spotlight on how these banks treat farmers. That's going to matter for a lot of folks." He didn't know what to say. Gratitude and humility crowded his throat, making it hard to speak. So he simply nodded and extended his hand. Yates shook it firmly. "Keep in touch," the senator said. "My office will stay involved as long as you need us." By the time Walter stepped outside, the midday sun was bright on the sidewalk. He took a long breath of crisp autumn air. The courthouse bell chimed noon somewhere down the block. For a moment he simply stood there, letting the sounds and smells of the town fill him up. This place wasn't perfect. It had seen its share of losses and disappointments. But it was still home. And he was still here. As he walked back to his truck, he caught sight of a familiar face. Thomas Grady, the bank representative who'd called him useless. Grady was standing by a black SUV, speaking to a colleague in a hushed, tense voice. When he noticed Walter, his expression flickered, shifting from annoyance to discomfort. Walter stopped a few paces away. He didn't plan to say anything. He didn't want a confrontation. But Grady straightened his tie and cleared his throat as if he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. "Mr. Harris," he began stiffly, "I see you've made quite an impression." Walter studied the younger man, noting the way his gaze skittered away. "Sometimes," he said evenly, "people need reminding that a man's worth isn't measured by a balance sheet." Grady flushed, his jaw working as though he wanted to respond but couldn't find the words. "I hope," Walter went on, "you remember that next time you think about calling someone useless." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked back to his truck, feeling lighter than he had in months. As he climbed inside and started the engine, he glanced in the mirror to see Grady still standing there, looking small in the bright afternoon. On the drive home, Walter replayed the town hall in his mind. The applause, the faces lifted toward him, the feeling that he'd reclaimed something he hadn't even realized he'd lost. He knew there was no guarantee the grants would be enough. The farm might still be sold. But today had proved something more important. That he wasn't invisible. That his life had mattered to someone besides himself. When he pulled up the long dirt drive, he noticed a car parked by the porch. For a second, he wondered if the bank had sent more papers. But as he stepped out, he saw Lisa climbing from the driver's seat, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Dad," she called, her voice catching. He froze, overwhelmed. "I couldn't wait until next weekend," she said, hurrying to him. "I had to see you." Before he could respond, she was hugging him, her arms tight around his shoulders. He closed his eyes and let himself lean into her warmth. "You didn't have to come," he whispered. "I did," she said, "because you're not alone anymore." He swallowed hard, pressing his cheek against her hair. For the first time in a long while, he believed her. Lisa stayed for the weekend, and Walter was surprised by how much lighter everything felt with her there. She moved around the old farmhouse with the ease of someone who still knew every creaking floorboard and dusty shelf. Saturday morning, she insisted on cooking breakfast, bustling about the kitchen in an old apron of Mildred's that she found folded behind the pantry door. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, plates of scrambled eggs and toast between them. Walter studied his daughter's face in the quiet moments, how the years had shaped it, how her eyes still mirrored her mother's. He realized he'd been wrong to try to protect her from the truth. All along, she'd been strong enough to carry it with him. After breakfast, they worked side by side, sorting through stacks of paperwork. Walter showed her the grant forms and the senator's card. She read everything carefully, making notes in the margins with a blue pen. "You've done more than most people would have," she said at last, setting the pen down. "I'm proud of you, Dad." He swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "I was afraid you'd think I'd failed." Her gaze softened. "Number, you did what you could. That's all any of us can do." In the afternoon, Callie stopped by to see if they needed anything. She brought fresh bread and a small bag of apples from her mother's trees. When she saw Lisa, she smiled and introduced herself. "Your dad's been the talk of the town," she said, glancing at Walter. "Everyone's saying how brave he was to stand up there." Walter shifted, embarrassed. "I just said what needed saying." "That's the bravest thing," Lisa said gently, reaching over to squeeze his hand. They spent the rest of the day cleaning out the old barn. Dust motes floated in golden beams of light as they sorted through broken tools and piles of rusted hardware. Walter paused over an old wooden crate marked Harvest 1984, remembering how he and Mildred had once packed it full of corn and carried it to the fair. It was funny how memories clung to the simplest things. As evening fell, Lisa cooked again, and they ate by lamplight. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but inside it felt warm and safe. When they finished, she cleared the dishes while he sat back, watching her with quiet gratitude. "You don't have to stay," he said finally, though he hoped she would. "I know," she said, her back still turned, "but I want to." Later that night, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The day had been ordinary in 100 small ways. Simple meals, chores, quiet conversation. But it felt like the beginning of something he hadn't dared hope for, a chance to reclaim the pieces of his life that still mattered. The next morning he woke early, even before the first light. He moved through the house in the hush before dawn, making coffee, feeding the old barn cat who'd adopted him last spring. When he stepped out onto the porch, he was met by a sky just beginning to soften with color. The cornfields lay quiet, the rows ragged but still standing. He took a slow breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs. Maybe the harvest would be thin this year. Maybe it would be the last he would see. But even so, he felt something like peace. After Lisa woke, they sat together on the porch, drinking coffee as the sun rose. For a while they didn't speak. Then she turned to him, her expression serious. "What if the grants don't come through?" she asked. He looked out at the fields. "Then I'll have to let it go." "That doesn't mean you've lost," she said firmly. He nodded, feeling the truth in her words. He had fought for this place. He had spoken up. He had reminded everyone, including himself, that his life meant something. By mid-morning, they had packed up the rest of the paperwork and driven into town to drop it off with Donna. She greeted them with a tired smile, promising she'd call as soon as she heard anything. "Whatever happens," she said, "you did the right thing." Walter thanked her. As they stepped back out into the sunshine, he realized how different everything felt. The fear wasn't gone, but it was smaller now, crowded out by the quiet strength of knowing he'd done all he could. As they drove home, Lisa reached over and rested her hand on his arm. He glanced at her, then back at the road. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a burden. He felt like a man with something left to give. The last week of September brought a shift in the weather. The sky, so long a pitiless glare, softened into grays and low, tentative clouds. By Friday afternoon, rain finally fell, thin and steady, soaking into the cracked earth with a sound like relief. Walter stood on the porch, one hand resting on the rail, and watched the fields drink it in. He could almost imagine the corn straightening, roots sighing in the soil. A few weeks earlier, he'd thought he would never see rain again. Now, it felt like a benediction. Lisa had gone back home to her family, but she called every evening to check in. Each time she ended the conversation the same way. "I love you, Dad, no matter what happens." He held those words close, the way he used to hold Lisa's small hand when she was a little girl trailing him down the rows of seedlings. On Monday morning, the phone rang just after sunrise. He answered it with a slow exhale, bracing himself for more bad news. But Donna's voice on the line was bright with something he hadn't heard before: excitement. "Mr. Harris," she said, "I have good news. The emergency grant was approved." He gripped the receiver tighter. "Approved? It'll cover 4 mortgage payments," she continued. "That buys you time, maybe enough to get the harvest in and reapply for further assistance. And the senator's office is following up to see if additional drought relief funds will be released." He closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. For a moment, he couldn't speak. When he finally managed it, his voice was rough with feeling. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "We don't give up on people who don't give up on themselves," Donna replied gently. "You've done everything right." When he hung up, he stood there in the kitchen, staring out the window at the rain. A lifetime of work had taught him that nothing was ever certain. But for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like a cliff edge. It felt like something he could walk toward, one step at a time. He spent the rest of the morning in the barn, repairing a section of fence that had sagged under the summer heat. Every nail he drove felt like an affirmation. Every board he set straight reminded him that he still had purpose, that he still belonged here. Around noon, he drove into town to pick up supplies. At the feed store, people greeted him differently. Heads nodded, hands reached out to shake his. Even strangers recognized him from the meeting. A young man in a ball cap stopped him in the aisle. "Mr. Harris?" he asked. "I was there when you spoke. My dad lost his farm last year, and I just wanted to say you made me feel like maybe it wasn't all his fault." Walter didn't know how to answer. He set a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Your dad did the best he could. That's all any of us can do." The young man nodded, blinking quickly, and Walter felt something shift in his chest, a blend of sadness and gratitude so profound it left him unsteady on his feet. Back home, he unloaded the truck and took a slow walk along the fence line. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. He paused by the rose bushes, bending to touch a bloom that had somehow survived the summer's heat. Pale pink petals, soft as memory. He thought of Mildred and how she'd planted those bushes the year Lisa was born. "I'm trying," he murmured. "I hope you'd be proud." In the weeks that followed, he settled back into his rhythms. Morning chores, evening phone calls with Lisa, small repairs that added up to something hopeful. The fear didn't vanish completely. He knew there would be more bills, more hurdles, but he also knew he wouldn't face them alone. One crisp October afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Senator Yates's office, confirming that additional drought relief was likely to pass in the state budget. Walter read the letter twice, his hand steady. He didn't know if he'd still be here to plant in the spring, but he did know he'd done everything he could, and that was enough. That evening, he sat on the porch as the sun went down, feeling the cool air settle around him. The fields glowed gold in the last light, rose neat and silent. He thought about all the times he'd been told to give up, all the ways he'd been measured and found wanting. And he felt something deeper than triumph, something like peace. He wasn't useless. He never had been. He was a farmer, a veteran, a father, a man who had stood his ground, and no matter what came next, he would keep standing. Thank you for watching this true story of resilience and dignity. If you'd like to hear more inspiring stories of everyday people who stood up for what mattered, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps keep these stories alive.